Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Huggy, and if you can believe it, we're on the 15th episode of the poker vlog. If you saw the last episode, we went on quite a downswing. Over 3 sessions, we lost almost $1,500, a number of buy-ins, pretty unfortunate. Things didn't run well, lost a bunch of hands, also just played some things poorly, but this session goes much better than the last one did. So those losing sessions all took place at Texas Card House. I decided to mix it up this time, and we head over to the lodge in Round Rock. I just want to focus on my Texas Holdem play this time, so I sit down for some 1-2 no limit Texas Holdem. We don't play any bomb pots, no PLO, and for this session I've got $400 ready to go, so I can buy in twice for $200, and I'm full of energy, so let's get going. The first interesting hand, we've got Queen 3 suited in clubs, and we're sitting in the small blind. It folds around to the cutoff, who limps in, and I complete, and the big blind checks. So we've got a small $6 pot. The flop comes 2-2 queen with 2 spades. So we flop top pair, but I don't know what the cutoff player limped in with, so I check to see what he does. It checks around, and we get a free turn. The turn brings the 9 of clubs. So not much changes here, and I lead now for $5. The big blind calls, and now the cutoff player raises to $15. It's a small raise, and it's got me raising my eyebrow. I doubt he's got a queen in his hand, or I imagine he would have led on the flop in position. He could have a 2, but I'm not inclined to believe there are many hands being open-limped in the cutoff that contain a 2 here. So I decide to make the call, and the big blind calls as well. And suddenly we've got a big pot brewing. The river brings the 10 of hearts. This river probably doesn't change anything unless the big blind called with a gut shot. I check, and the big blind checks, and now the cutoff bets for $25. Given the big blind's check, I imagine I'm probably ahead of his range, and I've under-repped my hand on the flop, so I decide to call here with top pair to see what I'm up against. The big blind folds, and the cutoff ends up showing 9-5 suited for a turned pair. I show my hand and we pick up a nice little pot, starting the session off on the right foot.
Thank you.
A few minutes later, we pick up king-queen offsuit. There's one limper, and I raise to $12 on the button. The blinds fold, and just the limper calls, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes 6-4 king rainbow, so we flop top pair second kicker. My opponent leads into me for $13. I'm likely ahead, but I decide to just call here since I've got position and can reevaluate on the turn. The turn brings the queen of spades, so now we've got top 2 pair, and unless my opponent flopped a set, we're way ahead here. My opponent leads for $30 now. I want to start getting money into the pot, so I raise and make it $90 total. My opponent thinks for a bit, and he ends up making the call. On the river, we see the 8 of clubs. The only hand I'm worried about on this river is 7-5, which would have picked up a straight. I don't expect that to show up here unless my opponent happens to have 7-5 suited in spades, which would have given him the flush draw as well. When my opponent checks to me, I decide to push all in here for $142 total. We see a quick fold and scoop a nice pot without a showdown.
Thank you.
Before we start on this next stand, there's 2 characters of note that I want to call out who are playing in this hand, who apparently have a history with each other at some of the higher stakes tables. They're playing incredibly aggressively. First, there's the big blind, who's been betting and raising without looking at his hands many times, and is simply being aggressive anytime his opponent shows weakness. Then there's the player to my right, who's been aggressively raising and pushing, though not without looking at his cards like the first player. We've got ace-9 offsuit, and we're sitting in the hijack. The player to my right raises to $20, and I pop it up to $75, figuring I'm easily ahead of his range since he's been so aggressive. It folds around to the other player, the big blind, who cold calls my re-raise, and the original raiser calls as well. So we've already got a $226 pot, and we've not even seen a flop yet. The flop comes king-queen 9 with 2 hearts. We flop bottom pair on a very wet, coordinated board. I was considering continuation betting if we hit a pair on just about any flop, but given the coordination of the board, I decide to check behind here after they both check to me. The turn brings the 8 of hearts. The very aggressive player in the big blind now pushes all in for his last $145. The player to my right, who I was more worried about between these 2 players, folds. So given how the big blind has been playing, I figure I could be up against any 2 random cards. I also recognize that there are both straight draws and flush draws on the board, which would give my opponent some equity to push with, even if he didn't have a hand. Considering both those things, I decide to make the call here with just third pair. On the river, we see the 8 of spades pairing the board. Our hand doesn't improve, and our opponent ends up showing queen 4 offsuit for second pair, beating our pair of 9s. Having had time to reflect on this hand, I'm not mad about my call here given my opponent's style of play. I mean, you can see he called a re-raise with queen 4 offsuit. However, I'm obviously disappointed with the outcome. 10 minutes later, we've got 6-4 suited in spades and we're sitting in the small blind. An early position player raises to $10. We see 2 callers, and I decide to call from the small blind as well. The big blind makes the call, and we've got 5 players to the flop. I check dark before we even see the flop come out. The flop comes 3-2 ace with 2 spades, so we flop a flush draw with a gut shot straight draw as well. It checks to the pre-flop raiser, who continuation bets for $17. There's now $67 in the pot, and I've got a pretty decent combo draw here that I'd prefer to just put some pressure on and take down here if I can. So I shove all in for $110. Everyone folds, and we pick up a needed pot after the previous big loss. In this next hand, we've got pocket nines. The middle position player limps, and I raise to $12 in the cutoff. The blinds fold, and just the limper calls, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes 8-5-2 rainbow. Shy of flopping a set, this is one of the best flops we could see for pocket nines. We've got an overpair to the board, and when our opponent checks, a continuation bet for $20. He quickly makes the call, so we're headed to the turn. The turn brings the 6 of hearts. My opponent checks to me, and even though I've still got an overpair, the board is getting pretty wet. I don't want to be check raised off my hand, so I opt just to check behind here. The river brings a beautiful 7 of diamonds. We hit the second nuts with a 9 high straight, and it's extremely unlikely our opponent has a hand like 10-9, considering that we've got 2 of the 9s in our hand. My opponent checks again, and I grab one of the 2 stacks in front of me and push it into the pot without even counting it. It turns out that it's a little bit more than I intended, $86, but that ends up not being a bad thing, as my opponent must not believe me, and after about a minute of thinking, he puts in the chips to call. I show my straight, and my opponent shows ace-8 for top pair. I guess he thought I was bluffing with air.
It started.
I ran hot after that, probably.
Yeah, you did.
I ran hot after that.
You ran hot as hell.
Man, what a good roll.
Just a few minutes later, we pick up pocket kings, and I'm first to act. I raise to $10, and the guy sitting 2 seats to my left re-raises to $20. It folds back to me, and I want to get more money in the pot here. I make it $70. It's a pretty big raise, but we're going to be out of position if he just calls. My opponent thinks for a little bit and ends up going all in for $199 total. I insta-call, and we get a full run out. Before we see any cards come out, my opponent tells me he has an ace, so we know what we're looking to dodge. The flop comes 5-3-2 rainbow, and my opponent picks up an extra 4 outs for the straight. Hopefully we can dodge them. The turn brings the 10 of spades, and the river brings 3 of spades. My opponent shows that he has ace-10, and our hand is good. He said he put me on kings and went with his hand because he had the ace and had to try for it. I'm thankful that he did.
Thank you.
A little bit later, we pick up ace-queen suited in clubs, and we're second to act. The under-the-gun player raises to $12. I consider 3-betting, but I haven't seen this player raise much pre-flop, so I decide just to call. The player behind me calls, the small blind calls, and the big blind calls as well, so we've got 5 players to the flop. The flop comes ace-10 jack rainbow, so we've got top pair second kicker with a gut shot as well. The original bettor leads now for $40. My best bet at this point is that he's probably got a hand like ace-king or ace-jack, both of which I'm behind. However, it feels too early to give up, and I've got the gut shot draw to go with my pair from behind, so with that I make the call. The player behind me folds, and both blinds make the call, so we've got a pretty big pot brewing with 4 of us going to the turn. On the turn, we see the 4 of clubs, so we pick up the nut flush draw to go with our top pair and gut shot draw. The same player leads again for about $100 this time, with only a little more than $100 more behind. Given his action, I'm putting him on at least 2 pair with ace-jack or better at this point. I've got a big decision on my hands here. Calling, raising, and folding all feel like legitimate plays. I'm getting the right odds on my draw to call, but I've got 2 players behind me left to act still. I don't want to get raised off my hand by either of them, given that both players have about $400 to $500 behind. However, given that neither player raised on the flop, it's possible we're up against worse pair plus draw type hands. I waver for a bit on what to do here, and although it's a bit risky, I end up just making the call. The player behind me thinks for a bit and ends up pushing all in for $440 total. The remaining player folds, and the original bettor calls with his last $112. I've really gotten myself into a tough spot here. The pot is now $972, and it's $340 more for me to call. I'm getting a little less than 3-to-1 odds on a call. I'm almost certain the player who pushed all in has king-queen for the flop straight, and I'm still pretty confident that the player on my right has a hand like ace-jack for 2 pair. If that's true, then I need to hit a club or a king to come out ahead here, which means I've got about 3-to-1 odds on a call. It's not exactly the right odds, but it's pretty close, surprisingly. I consider a few other factors before making a decision here. First, if I lose the hand, I'd be down only about $200 on the day. That's an amount I'd be able to swallow without feeling bad about it. Second, I'm a recreational player, and I'm not depending on this money for income as a professional player would. So with that, I can take a little bit more risk if I feel like the reward is worth it. And third, if I folded here and then saw one of my outs hit the river, I'd be absolutely kicking myself given the size of this pot. With these things in mind, I decide to go ahead and make the call. My opponents both announce their hands, and we see that the player who pushed all in does in fact have king-queen for the straight, and the original bettor has pocket jacks for a flopped set. I almost had it right. My outs are still the same despite not being quite right about the pocket jacks hand. We need to see a club on the river, though not the jack of clubs, or any king for a chop. On the river, we see a king, and not just any king, but the king of clubs. We hit the nut flush on the river, and I immediately announced my hand.
I got the flush.
Oh my god. Wow. Wow. Flush, and you had a straight draw.
I think I got you covered. Need to count it.
Crazy river.
Wow, it's a good thing I went to the restaurant.
Yeah.
Cards would have been different.
This is the biggest pot I've ever won playing poker. Over $1,300. $1,312 to be exact. I'm freaking pumped at this point. This is a huge, huge pot. I've never won one this big before.
Well, he had a straight and a flush.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For
Paired
sure.
it on.
10 minutes later, we pick up ace-8 offsuit. The end of the gun player limps, and everyone else folds to me, and I decide to raise on the button. Both blinds fold, and the limper makes the call, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes 6-3-7 with 2 spades. My opponent leads into me for $15 now. I opt to float here since I've got position on the hand, and I've still got 2 overcards with some backdoor draws. On the turn, we see the 8 of spades. We pick up top pair now, as well as the nut flush draw. My opponent leads again for $25 this time. It's hard for me to think of a hand he has that's ahead unless he limped a pair that flopped a set. We could be ahead here, but even if we're not, we've got outs with the flush draw, so I make the call. On the river, we see the king of hearts. We don't hit the flush, and our opponent leads for $45 now. I'm honestly feeling a bit speculative of what my opponent has here. The story just doesn't make a whole lot of sense with the exception of a possible flopped set. However, I think a set would probably have some concern about there being 3 to a flush on the board, slowing down the betting at some point. After a few seconds of thinking, I make the call. My opponent immediately says, and throws his hand into the muck. Sounds like we had the best hand the whole way through and made a good call.
Thank you.
We don't see many hands for about 40 or 45 minutes until I pick up ace-king offsuit sitting in the hijack. There's 2 limpers and I raise to $12. The small blind calls and both limpers call, so we've got 4 players to the flop. The flop comes 2-6-2 rainbow. This is a pretty safe, dry board to continue here. If I had an overpair, I'm pretty far ahead of most holdings my opponents could have. The small blind leads out for $15 and both other players fold. This is a pretty weak bet given the size of the pot, and I want to continue with the aggression. I've been showing down winners constantly, and I've got a massive stack that I want to put to use. I immediately raise to $50. My opponent quickly folds, and we start picking up pots again.
And we've got internet, TV, Netflix, and all that kind of shit. And we ran the fire. That's crazy.
A few hands later, we pick up ace-9 offsuit sitting under the gun. We don't have the best ace, but I play a little loose here, and I raise to $7 first to act. 5 players make the call, so there's 6 of us headed to the flop. The flop comes 2 ace-7 with 2 hearts. We flop top pair, and when it checks to me, I lead out for $22. 1 player calls behind me, and the small blind calls as well. The turn brings a 7 of spades, pairing the board. The small blind now leads out for $100. I don't think there's any way I'm ahead here, so I throw in my hand. The 3rd player folds as well, and unfortunately we don't get to see what our opponent had. I feel good about my fold though, given the action. Almost 30 minutes pass before we pick up king-9 suited, sitting in the small blind. The end of the gun player straddles for $7, and 3 players make the call. I decide to call as well here, and the big blind follows suit. The straddler ends up checking, so 6 of us get to see the flop. The flop comes 9-10-2 rainbow, so we flop second pair, second kicker. I check, the big blind checks, and the straddler leads now for $10. This is a pretty small bet relative to the size of the pot, which makes me think he's got something weak or might be on a draw. There's 1 caller between us, and I decide to put in a check raise to $40. The big blind cold calls the raise, the straddler calls, and the last player folds. On the turn, we see the 2 of spades pairing the board. Given the big blind's cold call, I'm reluctant to continue applying pressure here, so I shut down and decide to check. Surprisingly, both players check behind, so we get to see a free river. The river brings the 2 of diamonds. There's now 3 deuces on the board, so we've got a boat. If anyone was on a straight draw, they've completely whiffed. We're still behind anyone holding a 10 though. I put out a small blocking bet of $25, hoping we don't get raised. Surprisingly, both players fold, and we scoop the pot without even having to go to showdown.
I will. Now here's the question that they'll ask.
Thank you.
2 hands later, we're sitting in the cutoff, and we pick up ace-8 suited in diamonds. It folds to me, and I raise to $10. The button, the small blind, and the big blind all make the call. The flop comes queen-6 king with 2 spades. We completely whiff on this flop, and given the number of players in the hand, I'm ready to give up completely. The blinds check to me, I check, and the button ends up checking as well, so we get a free turn. The turn brings the 5 of hearts. Apparently no one likes this card either, as we all check around again. On the river, we see the 10 of diamonds. Everyone sticks with their stories, and it checks through one last time. I table my hand to keep things moving, and we see that we're up against ace-7, ace-4, and another hand that we don't get to see since he mucks. Not a very action-filled hand, but a funny one to see our ace-high being good here, even though we're 4-way on a very wet board.
I was ready to check.
Thank you.
Almost 20 minutes passes before this next hand. I almost left on the previous orbit, and I'm really glad I didn't. We're sitting in the small blind with 8-5 suited in spades. The under the gun player straddles for $7. 3 players make the call, and I call from the small blind. The big blind calls as well, and the straddler checks. So we've got 6 players headed to the flop. I check in the dark before the flop comes out. The flop brings 3 ace-4 of spades, so we flop an 8-high flush. Unfortunately, no one wants to take a stab at this flop, and it checks all the way around. Hopefully another spade doesn't drop unless it's the 2 of spades. Holy shit, we just hit the best possible hand in poker, a straight flush, the steel wheel. I lead for $10 in hopes of starting to build a pot now. We only get one caller, the under the gun +1 player. As the player on my right folds, he says,
I do not have the 5 of spades.
all I'm thinking is, shut up, dude. I'm hoping the player who called didn't hear, as we're heads up to the river. The river brings an inconsequential king of diamonds. Obviously, we want to get some more money into the pot, so I bet about half pot for $30. My opponent very quickly raises to 75. Are you kidding me? I'm putting him on exactly the king of spades at this point, and now I've got to figure out how much to raise. Before I do though, I've just got to double check. I really do have the 5 of spades, right? Okay, good. My opponent's got about $475 more behind. I don't want to leave any money on the table, and being in a spot like this is pretty damn rare. With that, I decide to ship it, and I announce,
All in?
All in.
over a minute passes before my opponent finally settles on a call. Holy crap. I flip up the cards and announce,
I got the straight flush.
Get that for the vlog.
Yeah.
Wow.
Pretty sure I have him covered.
You're gonna have to. You'll into like mounting them up.
Sorry, man. Thank you.
it didn't pick up on my phone, but the guy who called was definitely not happy and was making some negative comments in my direction as he shoved his chips at me, immediately leaving the table. This pot for $1,157 would be the biggest pot I've ever won at poker if it wasn't for the ace-queen hand earlier in the session. Hard to believe I've won my biggest 2 pots ever, less than 2 hours apart in the same session. The session was absolutely insane. I've never been so full of adrenaline after a poker session before. I mean, I was absolutely pumped, and I still am a week later just watching these hands again. I begged my wife not to pull the audio from her dash cam unless she wants to hear me screaming expletives over and over for 30 minutes. That's how excited I was afterwards. So to summarize, we played for 2 hours and 45 minutes, a little less than 3 hours. Bought in for $200, didn't need to buy in for the second bullet, and cashed out for $2,381. So after $58 of expenses for tips and hourly rate, that leaves us with a net gain of $2,123, which is pretty incredible. That's 14 times what we bought in for, just about. So from the previous 3 sessions where we lost almost $1,500, this one session undoes all of that, and it puts us about $650 ahead in the end, which is amazing. So we're moving back in the right direction, and I'm hoping to keep that momentum going. So until the next vlog, thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the video. It really helps out the channel, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, y'all.